The Life Coaching Toolbox Podcast is brought to you by Joeel and Natalie Rivera of Transformation Academy. In this episode, Natalie talks about REBT versus CBT, powerful tools for life coaching. This episode is one of 11 episodes in a series about CBT and REBT, which are powerful tools for coaching and together provide a human mind owner's manual.
I'm going to go over the similarities and differences between REBT and CBT. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is a well-known and widely used form of therapy that is often used in life coaching and by individuals on themselves. CBT is actually a subset of REBT. As REBT grew and became popular, some of the concepts and practices were broken off into a different focus, which was called CBT. While the two processes share much of their core principles, including that our behaviors and emotions are primarily caused by our attitudes, beliefs, and thoughts, there are a number of differences. The two processes focus on different aspects of cognition and have two different goals. However, the two methodologies work extremely well when used together, providing a complete process for evaluating and changing thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. The main premise of CBT is that our thinking is distorted. This distorted thinking leads us to feel negative emotion. In order to shift the negative emotion, we need to identify the distorted thinking and shift our perspective to something more positive. And by doing this, we shift our emotional reaction to the thought that we have about the situation. Now, in contrast, the main premise of REBT is that our emotional disturbances are caused not just by the distorted thinking, but by irrational core beliefs. While the end result of both CBT and REBT are aimed at the same thing, which is to change a person's emotional state and behavior, they use different processes to achieve the desired outcome. CBT focuses on changing the perception or interpretation of an experience, while REBT focuses on changing the underlying belief system that led to the interpretation in the first place. The idea behind REBT is that by ripping the cause of the dysfunction out by the root, which is the core belief, it prevents the pattern of negative thinking, negative emotion, and negative behavior from continuing to happen. So let's look at an example of how the two methodologies approach the same problem, and in this case, the problem being fear of rejection. So imagine you want to ask someone out on a date, but you're anxious about it. You tell yourself, well, she didn't smile or talk much on our first date. I don't think she's interested in me. You observed her behavior and made a judgment of what it meant, but the truth is there are many other reasons that could be the cause of her behavior, other than her not being interested in you. CBT would call this assumption cognitive distortion or mind reading, and would recommend that you find a more positive way at looking at the situation. So for example, you would identify that the assumption is just a cognitive distortion, and you would then reframe the situation by saying to yourself, I'm sure the reason she didn't smile or talk much is that she was nervous, or maybe something else was going on in her life. Having a second date with her would allow us both to begin to feel comfortable with each other and get to know each other better. And so changing the way that you were thinking about it would change the way that you felt about asking her on that second date, which would inspire you to be willing to reach out and ask her. So now let's look at REBT's perspective. REBT would look further than the negative interpretation of the event. Instead, it would seek to identify the underlying reason that you jumped to the conclusion that she wasn't interested in you in the first place. Why would your initial reaction be to assume that she didn't like you? Well, because you're afraid of being rejected, and you know that asking her puts you at risk of rejection. What do you believe that would lead you to fear being rejected? Again, digging deeper. Well, the belief that you absolutely need her acceptance, and if you don't get it, it would be awful. It would mean that you're a loser who will never find a relationship that lasts. That's what's going on at the deeper level. And at an even deeper level, there would be a belief that says, I need to be accepted by everyone that I deem important in order to be worthy as a human being. And this belief is, of course, irrational and it's extreme. However, it is beliefs like this that are at the root of all of our surface level irrational thinking and cognitive distortions. It's the reason for the assumption. So REBT would then help you to identify more rational beliefs to replace the irrational ones. For example, simply by changing the belief to say, I really want her to accept me, but I know that not everyone is going to like me and that that's okay. It does not determine the outcome I will experience with every other person. So by letting go of the absolute need for acceptance, the fear of rejection is softened. And at this point, the likelihood of your first assumption being that she doesn't like you diminishes. And even if you do think of it, you'll quickly remind yourself that it's not the end of the world, even if she does reject you. Both methods have the desired effect of helping you feel better about the situation and take action towards your goal, which is to ask her out again. But as you can see, the methods of addressing the deeper level belief through REBT processes has a higher likelihood of creating long-term change. And now that you have a general idea of the differences between the two, let's go over several distinctions that are important to understand about REBT, whether you plan to use it in conjunction with CBT or not. So the first one is the idea of a secondary disturbance. So in life, there are a variety of different disturbances that usually fall into two categories: a negative life experience or a negative emotional experience. And it's important to note, however, that sometimes a life experience is not actually negative. However, the person's interpretation of it is what makes it negative and causes negative emotional reactions. So CBT would look at this and say that the life experience simply is what it is, and the negative emotional experience is actually caused by the way that we think about the experience. Now, REBT would acknowledge another layer of disturbance that happens when not only do you feel anxious because you're going to ask a woman out on a date, you are afraid of feeling anxious while you're asking her on the date. So you're anxious about being anxious. You're worrying about worrying. And this is called a secondary disturbance. Disturbing yourself about your own emotional disturbance that you have about the actual situation is too much for anyone to handle, which is why these secondary disturbances are often the major factor in severe depression, anxiety, and panic. And another common secondary disturbance is guilt. So say you have an anger problem and you tend to snap at people that you love. You then feel guilty for not controlling your rage. Another great example is someone who is working on overcoming their problems and feels like they're not making progress as fast as they think that they should be able to. So they have their problem and the stress that it causes, plus the additional layer of emotional disturbance due to beating themselves up about their problem. So often, in order to deal with the primary problem, the secondary disturbance must be addressed first. So for instance, if a person cannot stop judging themselves for their nervous behavior, it makes it a lot harder for them to address the underlying problem, because every time they're asked to reflect on their experience of anxiety, they feel anxious about it, which then clouds their thinking. So another factor that differentiates is unconditional self-acceptance. CBT often focuses on improving a person's self-esteem by reinforcing their positive qualities and affirming their worthiness. In our CBT course, we call attention to the fact that trying to feel good about yourself actually works against you, because developing true confidence, because you actually need to believe that not only are you good at something, but that you actually can become good at something. Because if you don't, then the fear of failure will keep you from ever developing new skills and will lower your self-esteem. The truth is that true confidence is a belief that you are always able to learn and improve in any area. And that is what we call having a growth mindset. And we address this in our CBT course and in our Developing True Confidence course, in case you are interested in either of those. REBT has a different method for improving self-esteem, which is unconditional self-acceptance. It encourages people to stop self-rating and instead accept themselves as imperfect human beings regardless of their traits or behaviors or how others see them. Instead of rating their self, they would evaluate the results of their actions and behaviors and seek to change them. Not because of a negative judgment of those behaviors, but because of the undesirable outcomes that happen because of them. So the other factor that is different is the focus on that negative emotions can be helpful. Because there's a difference between an inappropriate negative emotion and a helpful or appropriate negative emotion. So anxiety, depression, and anger are examples of unhealthy negative emotions, while sadness, sorrow, concern, or regret are considered healthy emotions. So later in this course, we're going to get into more detail about healthy versus unhealthy emotions. But for example, if you feel intense sadness and grief when you lose a loved one, this is completely appropriate and healthy. However, if you feel anxious about arriving late to a meeting, this is considered unhealthy because the reason behind your anxiety is the fear of judgment and rigid thinking that says you must never be late to a meeting. While you might believe it seems reasonable to feel anxious if you're going to be late, the truth is that feeling anxious does not help the situation or make you get there faster. All it does is make your ride unpleasant and put you in a negative emotional state when you enter that meeting. And there's also a difference between moderate anxiety in that situation versus panicking about it. So the power of REBT and CBT is that both of them give you the tools that help you learn how to manage these emotional reactions, making whether you feel anxious when you're late to a meeting your choice.
Visit transformationacademy.com/toolbox to download free life coaching worksheets that go with the activities discussed in this podcast, plus other resources for creating a thriving life coaching business.